Come on in, get a seat. As usual, we're under some time pressures. We have a very exciting and extensive lineup this morning. My name is Christopher Gaffney, an independent scholar based out of New York. I've researched impacts of mega events for many years and on the scientific committee of Play the Game. So thank you all for being here this morning. We have 6 speakers dealing with a theme: sustainable mega events, a distant dream. And I think it's easier for the speakers to just stay on the floor, so I'll just call them up one by one as their time comes, and we have between 12 and 15 minutes per speaker. Depending on the rhythm we go at here, we'll take a break after the 3rd or 4th speaker, and then we'll come back for the final 2 or 3, depending on what it is, and then we'll open for questions, as has been the pattern so far. And so I'd like to call to the floor now Professor Arne Solberg from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, who will talk about hosting mega events and why all the problems. Thank you, Arne.
Thanks. Okay, welcome everybody, and thanks for attending. Yeah, this is a topic that has been received a lot of attention at this conference, and unfortunately, I think it will continue to do that. But just as a warming up, let's look at some slides. Rio, I mean, there have already been a lot of presentations about Rio. South Africa, white elephants, cost overruns. Sochi, the second highest cost overruns in the Olympic history after Montreal Games. So the question is, I mean, are these problems specific for sport events? Is the sport industry or the sport business worse than other industries with regards to, for example, the ability of calculation or estimating the costs, estimating the revenues? Is this a special problem? The answer is, as these figures shows, partly yes, at least with regards to cost overruns. This is from the research from Bent Flyvberg and his colleague at Oxford University, where they compared large-scale projects and the ability to keep the budget. And as we see, they looked at 10 Olympic Games, which on average has a cost overruns on 156% in fixed prices. That means not nominal prices. If measured in nominal prices, that means not adjusted for general inflation, then the figure was over more than 300%. And all 10 Olympics had significant cost overruns, actually. One speciality, as you'll see, the schedule overrun is 0. That means the Olympics, when they are going to start, let's say 20th of February, they start that. While an ordinary road, an ordinary tunnel, whatever hospital, whatever project, there can be a kind of deadline, but nevertheless, no catastrophe if it's becoming too late, actually. So, the pattern in the history is quite conclusive. Yes, there are significant problems. Cost overruns, white elephants have received a lot of attention. But in general, I mean, if you invest in something and you based the decision whether or not to invest on prices, expected costs, well, and these expected prices and costs turn out to be wrong, okay, then you're likely to make the wrong decision, to invest in activities that you shouldn't invest in, because there will other activities that will pay more off for the taxpayers in general, actually. So, but of course, someone would say it's not hosting events, not only about achieving monetary benefits, and that's absolutely correct. But the problem is that, well, history tells that they are hosted in a way which leave us with white elephants, where we spend much more than we actually planned. So in some cases, the decisions are likely to have been different if we had knew the correct costs. And one example we have from Norway, we hosted the Winter Olympics in 1994. The games were awarded in 1988. The budget slightly above 1 billion Norwegian kroner. 2 years after, they recalculated and re-estimated the budget, which then had to increase with about 400–500% actually. And the culture minister at that time, he was quite openly, had we knew, we would never give the financial guarantee actually. Okay, so why is my question? I mean, this is a conference with a combination of journalists and researchers actually, and it's a very good combination. The journalists are very good digging up the dirt, finding, going into detail about the specific cases. And that's very important that someone does that, actually. Our job as academic researchers is more to find, let's say, what are the reasons behind these incidents? What are the patterns? What are the driving forces? Why do history repeat itself over and over again? And we have this habit of looking into theory. Are there some theoretical perspective that can help us to understand these phenomena, to analyze these problems? Why they repeat themselves over and over again, actually? Because they don't go away with Samaranch, with Blatter, and whoever they are, actually. History is quite conclusive there, actually. We have an incident in Norway now, by the way. We hosted the World UCI World Cycling Championship in Bergen a couple of months ago. Very successful, a good festival. People really, really enjoyed it. Good TV pictures. So the non-monetary impacts were very, very valuable and good, and people really enjoyed it. But the other side, the last rumors now says that the Norwegian Cycling Federation is on the brink of going bankruptcy, actually, because of this, actually. Okay, so what kind of theory will I look at? Well, we call it principal agent theory. And what is that? Well, we can imagine two alternative situations. A principal is someone to hire an agent to do a job for him or her, actually. It could be the traditional employer versus employees perspective. It could be the IOC hiring cities, FIFA hiring nations to host their World Cup. Within an event, the local organizer might hire entrepreneurs to construct venues and so on. Yeah, there are a lot of other examples as well. The other alternatives, that's where I'm sort of stretching the theory a little bit, though. Andreff might not agree that it's really a principal agent theory, but nevertheless, the forces in work are the same. And then I look at situations where the agents, they are not necessarily hired by their principal, but they identify that the principal have some objectives. And then they try to convince the principal that, okay, if you, for example, host an event, then you can improve the health conditions of people. Maybe there is a recession, economic recession, so you can stimulate the economy, reduce unemployment, promote the city as a tourist destination, or the nation as a tourist nation, and so on. The agents, who are they? And in this perspective, I say that the government is the principal. So who are the agents? Well, as you see the list, it could be, for example, the owners of the event, International Sport Federation, the IOC, FIFA, but it could also be ASO, the owner of the Tour de France and the major cycling events. I mean, as we probably know, there are more and more commercial owners of events intervening now, actually. X Games and whatever they are called, actually. And I think it's very important to understand the forces in work. What are the objectives, actually? And what are the objectives on the International Sport Federation, or these owners? Well, we have to in mind that they compete with one another for your and my attention as a TV viewer. Because that is the oil in this engine, actually. Receiving attention as TV viewers, actually. And therefore, there's an ongoing process where they try to improve the quality of their sport. And, for example, I'm not a religious person, but I use this metaphor saying it's not God up there that has decided that the ski jumps has to be bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, actually. Some years ago, when I started to follow ski jumping, ski flying, the world record was 150 meters. Now it's about close to 260 meters. And stadiums, the same, they have to be improved. The sponsor want fascinating stadiums, good TV pictures, and so on. So if one sport is improving themselves, okay, the other has no choice to go to do the same, actually. If not, they fall on the ladder, on the financial ladder, or let's say the popularity ladder. And if so, they also are falling on the financial ladder, actually. The others also have their objectives. Local public sector, for example, operate as an agent toward the government because they know, I mean, the Olympics, the FIFA World Cup, they require you need to have a governmental guarantee, financial guarantee, actually. So you take away the risk. I mean, if you are going to buy a new car or whatever, new house, someone others is taking the financial risk. I'm pretty sure that you wouldn't buy the cheapest car or the cheapest apartment, actually. If the government is giving you the financial guarantee, actually. Entrepreneurs, the same. An entrepreneur, I mean, there are conflicting interests, obviously. Other things equal, an entrepreneur would prefer to build a stadium with, let's say, capacity 60,000 instead of 30,000. So there are a number of conflicting interests between the agents and the principals, actually. National Sport Federation, they know that if you are going to host a mega event, okay, the sponsors, the national sponsors, are much more likely to support our sport and so on. Okay, and then we have, that's a speciality with principal agent relations, namely that we have situation of asymmetric information, where one side is better informed than the other. And in general, it tend to be the agents that are better informed than the principal. I mean, history tells us that these objectives are not met in connection to mega events. The economy is not stimulated as much as the over-optimistic consultancy reports predict, actually. Costs tend to be higher than expected. Unemployment does not disappear because of the Olympics and so on. And in general, research also shows that the tourist doesn't come in massive after the events. According to my research, for example, they've shown that we had indicate that people are more likely to go to another event, similar event, another place in the world, whatever that is, instead of going back to the previous host, actually. So, and free riding is an important part of this. Because, as I said, when other is paying, in general, the government is paying. Okay? That makes something with your behavior. You are more likely to take risk. You are more likely to spend than you otherwise would do. So I use this graph when I teach this principal agent theory. We measure now the input, the level of input along the horizontal axis and the net benefit along the vertical axis. And if you have a situation like this, where the optimal level for how much input to put in is the same for the principal and the agent, well, there is no problem. The agent will put in as many efforts that the principal won't. And the benefits could be profit, it could be reducing of unemployment, could be promotion of the city, could be health improvement, and so on. The problems appear when you have this situation, where the agent's benefits are maximized at a much higher level than the optimal level for the principal. And remember, we have this situation of asymmetric information, where, as I said, the agents very often have more information and also can mislead the principal. And that's where the problems come. So if the agent can convince that the blue dotted curve is the correct net benefit curve for the principal. Then we can up it in a situation with white elephants, with cost overruns. Unemployment is not being reduced as much as we expected, actually. So, to summarize, the main reason why I see behind this problem are these conflicting interests between the principals and the agents. Where the agents behave, what we say, opportunistic. They maximize their own benefits and at the cost of the principal. And what's important, when I say that the principal in this context is the government, I'm not actually 100% correct, because the real principal are us as taxpayers, as residents, actually. So if too much is spent on the event, okay, it's less for us to spend on whatever other, hospitals, universities, roads, other investments, actually. And this combined with naive expectations, very often, if you go around and ask people in the in an upcoming hosting event region, you see dollars in their eyes. They expect no massive tourism, inbound tourism afterwards. And if so, it's much easier to say yes to invest more than you actually had planned. Okay, yeah, I'm run over time, so sorry for that, but thanks.
Thank you, Harry. And I just realized that I can take credit for everything everyone says here because my name is right here. So I'm going to take this, and sorry about that, Harry. Yes, I'll take the questions too. And as I was preparing for this session this morning, I was looking at the resumes of all our speakers, and our next speaker, Wladimir Andreff, by the time you're done reading his resume, it will be time for the coffee break. And every one of our speakers has a resume about as long as your arm. And so it's truly a pleasure to welcome the Professor Emeritus, Wladimir Andreff, and give your attention to him. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So I have two titles for my presentation, either softening or alleviating the winner's curse, but it's always the same problem, how to combat cost overruns in hosting mega sporting events. So, so this way. How does it work? Okay, that's it. So, what is the winner's curse all about? This phenomenon has been discovered a long time ago to explain low returns on investment by companies engaged in competitive bidding for oil and gas leases in the Middle East countries. And these countries were putting companies into fierce competition through auctioning. And the same phenomenon has been discovered for financial markets by Richard Thaler, the Nobel Prize winner in economics. So with a lot of mathematics, it has been demonstrated that usually, and this is important, in any auction type setting where the value of the auctioned object is uncertain but will turn out to be the same for all bidders, the party who overestimates the value is likely to outbid the competitors and win the contest. So the bidder who has the most aggressively bid and overestimated the value of the object will be the winner, but he will yield an expected financial loss. So this is a nice case of, let's say, adverse selection of an investment project in terms of economics. So what about the Olympics? For the Olympics, nobody knows the real value of being selected to host the games. Nobody knows that. And then we enter every time in a bidding process where the IOC objective is to obtain the best possible Olympics project in terms of quality, security, telecommunications, and so on and so forth. and by selecting or voting for the best host cities candidature file. But in this process, the Olympics has not an actual detailed knowledge of the Olympics project, despite a number of site visits, and its knowledge is much lower than the knowledge of the cities itself about its own project, and we are again in a situation of information asymmetry, just like it was pointed out by Harry. So on the side of the candidate cities, what is the objective? Obviously, it's to get the games. And for this reason, all the cities are ready to overbid for getting the games. And they are used to underestimate the costs in order to win the bid, you know, or to overestimate the impact or the benefits. And then the winner's curse emerges as soon as a city is a candidate with other candidates to outbid. Then you have an overbidding process, and the winner is cursed by the very IOC auction-like allocation process. As you know, some IOC requirements are mandatory, so there is less overbidding about the sporting facilities, but the overbidding is primarily going with the quality of non-sporting infrastructures, the quality of ceremonies, and this is what is appealing for the votes of the IOC members in favor of what I would call the most fantabulous project or the most magnificent project among the cities. And as you can understand, the most fantabulous is usually the most costly as well. So there are a number of indicators for the winner's curse. Due to time limits, I will stick to just one of them, which is cost overruns. So what is a cost overrun? It is when you observe an ex-post achieved cost, which is much bigger than the ex-ante announced cost in the candidature file, you know? So, and you come 7 years later and you see that the cost is twice bigger, for instance. I would focus on this. So, I have a lot of empirical evidence about the Olympics cost overruns. Look at this. In this table, you have a comparison between the ex-post and ex-ante cost for all Olympics since Munich 1972. And if you look at all the table down to London 2012, you see every year you have a bigger, for each Olympics, you have a bigger ex-post cost than the ex-ante cost, with just one exception, which is Los Angeles 1994. We can come back to this exception during the discussion and look at this for the Winter Olympics since Lake Placid 1980 down to Sochi 2014. Again, you have always an ex-post cost which is bigger than the ex-ante cost. So the theorem of the winner's curse is proved, okay? And then comes the following point, which is that the number of candidate cities becoming aware of the winner's curse and the cost overruns, you have less and less cities which are applying for hosting the games. The number is down to 2 in 2022 and not 2002, okay? We had only 2 candidates for 2024 and just 1 for 2028. How many in 2026? This is really what the IOC is scared about now. How many in 2032? And as you know, a number of candidate cities are resigned after negative votes or referendums or after some political decisions. So there is a big issue. So before solving the issue or suggesting some solutions, I would give you a good news first. There will be no cost overruns with Los Angeles 2028. And then what about Paris 2024? So Los Angeles, de facto, was the only candidate city for hosting the 2028 games. So there was no auction. When you have just one candidate, no auction. Then no bidding process. Thus, no overbidding. And thus, no cost overruns. So according to the theory, there will be no cost overruns in Los Angeles 2028, just like in Los Angeles 1984, because Los Angeles was the unique candidate for 1984. Los Angeles now is in a stronger position to bargain hosting terms with the IOC. The process is on the tracks. They are also ready to utilize previous equipments, and they will have sponsorship potential ahead of the usual schedule. They will be able to use the Olympics rings for 11 years instead of 7 years, which is a good news in terms of money. And outside my theory, in addition, Los Angeles is 100% financed by private funds. So what about Paris 2024? My guess is that there is a good probability of a lower cost overrun for Paris 2024 than in the previous editions. Why? First, because the overbidding process stopped as early as July 2017, when the decision was made of allocating both the 2024 and 2028 Olympics together in Lima in September. So the overbidding process was shorter than usual. Then there are few new sport facilities to be built in Paris, just like in Los Angeles. And as you could have seen in the tables very swiftly, the cost overruns is basically triggered by non-sport infrastructures. And in the second rank, the cost runover on sports equipment. So we have few sports, non-sport infrastructure to build in Paris. And the third and very small reason may be my own suggestion, since I'm working with the Ministry of Sport. My suggestion is to create an external auditing body to supervise the cost evolution over 7 years. So this project is under examination by the Minister Cabinet now, and the idea is to primarily avoid cost overruns on those costs financed by public funding, because when you have a cost overruns on public funds, then you have to ask taxpayers to pay more, and this is what an economist cannot accept. So, to finish up, what could be the solutions? So one series of solutions is to soften or alleviate the consequences of the winner's curse. So we are sure that we'll have cost overruns. What can be done? So in the long run, we can imagine to move an increasing share of the sporting facilities infrastructures that can be dismantled from one Olympic site to the next one. But we need some technological progress in order to find the new technologies which make able to move all the infrastructure, okay? So it's not realistic so far. A next idea is to restrict the auction to those biggest cities where required facilities and infrastructures are already available. But if we decide this, then there is no longer any chance for developing countries, emerging countries, and small developed countries to host the games. Third solution, we can suggest the IOC to significantly lower the prerequisites, its prerequisites in terms of brand new sporting equipments, in terms of modern infrastructures like media, airports, and so on, downsizing the ceremonies, downsizing the size of the delegations. So in a nutshell, downsizing the games, transforming them into a less luxury good as it is now, okay? And this is the best way to combat their gigantism, so-called gigantism, and their cost. And in my view, it is the only option if we want to have the games once hosted in developing countries, let's say in Africa, for instance. Then another idea is this external regular auditing body, just like the one we are talking about in France. A next solution could be a rotation rule of the bid across the continents or across other regional international subdivisions. So this is more or less the implicit FIFA World Cup option. You know, they rotate the World Cup across the continents. But in a table which is missing in my slides, I've checked that the FIFA World Cup is also has also a phenomenon of cost overruns, a little bit smaller than with the games. But anyway, it does not cure the issue. And the last idea is what I would call the Lima 2017 win-win formula, as it has been put by Thomas Bach himself. Okay, the idea is to allocate as many further Olympiads as the number of actual candidates. So in 2024, we had 2 candidates. We allocated one for 2024 and the other one for 2028. Let's imagine that we'll have 3 candidates for 2032. The suggestion would be to allocate one for 2032, another one to 2036, and the last one for 2040. Then the auction-like process would be stopped starting from the second and the third host city. So what about, to finish up, what about giving up the auction, curing definitely or cutting the roots of the cost overruns? Then we have to give up the auction-like allocation process. So one idea is to fix once and for all the Summer Olympics site. It has been suggested in Olympia for 1996, but in fact Athens was the candidate. We can have the same idea for the Winter Games. Another idea is a rotation across the few best hosting cities so far. We have 3 cities which have hosted the Games 3 times, Paris, London, Los Angeles. Let's rotate the Games only across these 3 cities, which is again a kind of fixing the site. And another one is a distribution of different Olympic sports contests across different competing candidate cities, what I would call the UEFA 2020, the UEFA Euro 2020 solution, with the competition located in 13 countries, okay? But there is a price to pay here. You will have a very low local economic impact, but also a very low cost. And then 2 sentences with the options which would absolutely give no chance to cost overruns. One is a lottery across all potential candidate cities. Then in this case, no bidding, no overbidding, nothing, no cost overruns. And the other one is absolutely the contrary. We could decide that the IOC will have a discretionary authoritative decision choosing the city, saying, okay, it will be Buenos Aires next time. Why? No matter. But then this is the most costly solution for the IOC itself, because in this case, the mayor of Buenos Aires will say, okay, you pay the bill. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. I guess one of the options is to actually have the IOC pay for their own party as well, but we can pick that up in the discussion. Now we turn to one of the most recognizable figures in world football, the captain of the 1994 Brazilian World Cup champions, Oliveira. Please.
Morning. It's a little bizarre because I'm a little more nervous than when I kick a penalty in the stadium with 100,000 people regarding me, but let's do it. I'm here today as the president of Atletas pelo Brasil, Atletas for Brazil. It's an honor to be part of such important events. I was supposed to be talking about legacy, about Rio after the games. I will. But in our opinion, the legacy were our mistakes, the big mistake, and especially the lessons that we have learned from them. I will start talking about Atletas pelo Brasil because this organization is the most innovative initiative in sports in the last decades. Who we are. I will give you a very quick background overview about this organization. Many athletes had created their own NGO many works in sports for all and education in the poorest areas of Brazil. At some point, we realized that we were achieving great results individually. If acting alone was already generating a certain important social impact in a local level, we reflect. Imagine the power of working together as one group with the same objectives, with the potential to transform the national policies, impact in the national levels. In 2006, Atletas for Brazil was founded, and we embarked in this great adventure. Today, we are a team of 67 athletes, and we have a board, strategic political advisory with very important people in Brazil. We have a high-level team behind us as well, lawyers and advocacy specialists. And these 67 athletes are from different modalities and generations. This is a pioneer initiative. I have never seen anything similar around the world that's gathered representatives from many different modalities and different generations. Our mission, I love it, our mission. Improve sports to improve Brazil, to improve our country. Our vision, a country where everyone can have access to sports. As you can see, we put the bar very high. In 2009, when Brazil was appointed as the next Olympic Games host, we didn't have all those reasons to celebrate. At that point, we were established and mature enough. We knew that the big fight was still to be won. We want better sports. We want better sports in our schools. We want better sports for all, better governance. We want to create a real legacy. What we do and how we work. We integrate private, public and sports sectors, and civil society with the purpose to improve sports, and through the sports, improve the life of Brazilian people. Differently from the individual works as NGO, where we act directly in and with the communities, at Atletas pelo Brasil, Atletas for Brazil, we do political actions. We do advocacy, which means lobby, research and content productions, raise awareness, communication, mobilization, all of these points in the same strategy. Among many victories we achieved since the beginning of our history, in 2013 was for sure a mark of the country, a game-changer moment for sports in Brazil. With a great advocacy strategy and lobby, we managed to change a very important article in the sports law, the Article 18A. The new article creates new rules for sports entities' access to public funding. The main changes are, some of them, limit the President Federation mandate to maximum 4 years plus 1 re-election to force the renovation. Before, there was no limit. More transparency, as we can see. Participation of athletes in the Electoral College. Another big achievement that you had was we brought the private sector to play the game, our game, together. We build, or we help to build a private sports sponsor agreement. We call it a Pact for Sports. An agreement where the private sector, we only consider sponsoring a sports organization if they comply with some criteria of good governance, practice, and transparency. Today, the pact has 27 big companies, signatories. The pact formed by 10 clauses, which includes being aligned, of course, with the 18A article, ethics conduct, buying procedures to prevent corruptions, policies for supplier selection, and some others, etc. With these companies, we develop a rating, like the company's rating. We develop a rating of sports entities. This is a new program that you are working on currently, and will be launched in 2018. Here, an idea of the companies that are part of the pact. As we can see, there are even competitive companies together in this codes. Together, they account for 60% of private research investing in sports in Brazil. Very powerful group. Now, let's talk a little bit about legacy. 2016 legacy. This is the reality. It's an image of the reality in Brazil. The photo talk for itself. 2016 legacy. This is the reality. What was left? Abandoned Olympic venues, the white elephants. Lack of planning for the next Olympic cycles. Decrease of public research for sports. New scandal involving Rio 2016. But the game goes on. Today, our recognition has given us access to important movements in the national level. We have voice, we are respected, and we are being called to attend important discussions and participation in a key decision led by the government. Examples. Approval of the National Sports Plan, we are part of. Olympic Legacy Evaluation Committee, they called us to be part. New legislation for increased athletes' participation, confederation and federation. And with this current scenario of crisis in the institution, besides the fact that the Brazilian Olympic Committee's statute was not in accordance with the 18A article, they had to start a reform the statute. And Atletas for Brazil and another important organization in Brazil, Solberg Sports, were also called to be part of this discussion. Which was our key claims for the new statute? Create an advisory board, create an ethics committee, gender balance, increase of athletes' participation on the board, on the assembly. So, this is how we are recognized today by the highest level of the Brazilian institution. We have a voice. I want to share a very recent and current example of how we act. The Olympic Committee, Brazilian Olympic Committee, voted against to increase the representation of athletes on the board. We react very quickly, immediately. We use our power of mobilization, and through the social media network, we released a series of memes showing our anger. As a result, it was yesterday, as a result, there will be a new assembly to ensure a third of athletes in the electoral college. What's our next goals? Our next goals are create an independent agency to control access to the public funding, a sports entity assessed by rating, the new program that we will launch in 2018, reform the national sports system to think about the new sports public policy, which have a better integration with ministries of sports, health, and education regarding physical activities. A real sports public policy. What's the dream? We have a dream some years ago, more than 10 years ago, to mobilize the athletes in one direction and to do not our mission. And now we have, of course, the other dreams. The dream is to have sports as a vehicle for reducing inequality. And the dream also, the sports as an example of a public policy for social justice in Brazil, in our country. Thank you very much. I'd like just to thank the Luis, it's our team is here, who prepared this presentation. And I would like to asking you a little more applause for my colleagues, the athletes who are in Brazil watching us. Thank you, guys.
Muito obrigado, Capitão. I think we have time for one more before the coffee break, so I'll ask Professor Jules Boykoff, who also has a resume as long as your arm, to come up here and talk to us about activism, protest, and the 2016 Olympics.
Hello, everybody. In the last decade, we have seen a remarkable transformation in the way that sports mega events are discussed in the public sphere. I've had a front row seat for this critical turn as someone who's carried out scholarly research on the Olympics and also engaged with the general public on the topic through my writing and my commentary. When it comes to the Olympics, as many of you in this room already know, here's the scoop. In the 21st century, activists, journalists, and academics have boldly confronted the legends that have long buoyed the Olympic movement. In their heyday, luminaries from the International Olympic Committee could trot out a trusty cluster of cookie-cut promises about surefire upticks in tourism, jobs, environmental benefit, and economic growth. But in recent years, most of these assurances have essentially been debunked, and this has deeply affected wider public discussions. The result, in the 21st century, fewer and fewer cities are game to host the Olympic Games. Nowadays, activist movements crop up in pretty much every aspiring host city, leaning on academic research to make their case. Referenda have become the civic brickbats for activists. Just last month, Innsbruck had its bid for the 2026 Winter Games derailed by an unsuccessful referendum. It's fair to say that the Olympics have descended into a bit of a slow-motion crisis. Activism, academia, movements, and math help explain why. Now, today I'm going to focus on the activist piece of the puzzle, but I think it makes sense to quickly lay out what's animating these activists to step up and create fact-based anti-Olympics campaigns. For starters, there's overspending. As we've already heard, Sochi's a prime example of that. But Pyeongchang, which starts 73 days from today, has seen its initial budget double through time. Same thing with London, same thing with Vancouver. And activists are quick to point out that beyond the numbers sit values. All the billions spent on mega events have opportunity costs. That money could have been spent on healthcare, education, public infrastructure, and so on. As we've also heard, white elephants is a serious problem. Here we see Athens. There's also Turin, perhaps one of the best uses of venues afterwards. Actually, refugee communities are squatting there currently in a self-governing community. We also have Rio, in record time, has fallen into pretty quick disrepair. Meanwhile, I think it has to be said that the International Olympic Committee takes no credit for what's left behind. They're a floating para-state that all too often acts like a pitiless parasite. The militarization of the public sphere is another issue that activists have with the games. Local and national security officials leverage the games as an opportunity to get all the weapons and special laws they wouldn't be able to get during normal political times. The Vancouver 2010 Olympics, for example, brought 1,000 new surveillance cameras that, guess what, weren't boxed up after the Olympics and returned to the sender. In fact, they became part of normal policing in the wake of the games. In London 2012, they actually placed surface-to-air missiles in various locations, including on top of an apartment building where people actually lived. Let's face it, even the mascots look like walking surveillance cameras. Rio, of course, as is well known, also militarized. Now, the flip side of this is repression. While the Olympics justify the creation of this security structure to thwart terrorism, it can often be turned against activists to intimidate them. In fact, terrorism is often conflated with protest. As we see here with the London Olympic head, who gave a list of the scariest things in his mind, terrorism and protest were at the top of the list. Then you look at the bid books for the Rio Games. They actually had a section that was called Activist Terrorist Risks. And as a side note, this was the one section of the entire bid book that mentioned indigenous people, despite the fact that there are more than 200 thriving indigenous groups across Brazil. Now, despite this repressive apparatus, the activism has continued. Activists have also raised concerns about how sports mega events cause social dislocation, both through the iron fist of displacement as well as the velvet glove of gentrification. Beijing is a good example. Rio as well, 77,000 people displaced from their homes to make way for Olympic infrastructure and transport. Then there's greenwashing, and that's publicly voicing concern for the environment while doing the very little that you can to claim the green mantle. London, they actually created a new category of sponsors. Who doesn't think of BP when they think of sustainability, right? I know that on the US Gulf Coast we certainly do. It turns out that there was actually a watchdog group that looked at the standards for becoming a sustainability partner and found that there weren't any. It was essentially a pay-to-play charade. Now, perhaps Rio is the most egregious example of greenwashing. It's so painful to even say these things out loud, but some of the promises in the bid suggested, for example, that Guanabara Bay, which you see here, would have 80% of the water that was moving into it treated before the Olympics arrived. When the Olympics actually arrived, however, it was more like 20%. That's just one example. But I suppose here's a picture I took of the area around Guanabara Bay feeding into it. I suppose you could say that Rio got its green spaces. They did paint the cement green around the venues, which I suppose from a television helicopter might have looked like grass almost. Not to be outdone, there is Pyeongchang, as I say, coming right up here to make way for a ski run. They cut down a 500-year-old ancient forest, home to a number of endangered species. Now, all these issues I'm talking about have combined to jumpstart Olympic descent in the host city. Because the games are such a monstrous juggernaut, they bring together activists who typically might not work together with their regular activism. But I should point out that a number of campaigns in cities across the globe have actually prevented the city from getting the Olympics. These are some documents I pulled out of an archive around the Toronto bid, which they stopped in the 1990s. You've seen that also in places like Berlin, Chicago, Hamburg, which you see an image of here, Budapest, Boston, and elsewhere. In fact, in Denver in the early 1970s, they actually were given the games by the IOC, but a coalition of conservatives and progressives came together and just said no, and then the IOC had to move the Olympics to Innsbruck. This outburst of anti-Olympics activism harkens to the words of Native Hawaiian political theorist Noenoe Silva, which you can see here. But how anti-Olympics activism carves crevices into rock depends on the activist cultures and political histories of the host city. I've been traveling through many of these host cities in the extended Olympic moment and working with activists in these various towns, and What I've noticed is in Vancouver, there was a very strong, I'm not the first one to notice this, a strong indigenous presence there, and that took over in a lot of ways, a really prime role in the activism against the Olympics. That's when they stole the Olympic flag, actually, at one moment I can talk about later. One of the big themes and slogans was "No Olympics on Stolen Native Land." There was a wide-ranging coalition from anarchists to civil libertarians, from poets to media activists. They occupied public space, they used a diversity of tactics, and they showed brass-knuckle seriousness. In London, we saw something a little bit different, a go-with-the-grain protesting that used humor a bit more. The Counter Olympics Network served as an activist hub and organized the one big mobilization of the Olympics. There were dubious corporate sponsorships which gained the attention of activists, including one campaign called the Greenwash Gold Campaign, which focused on Olympic sponsors BP, Rio Tinto, and Dow. They actually held an award ceremony there in Trafalgar Square where they doused themselves with green liquids and were, by the way, promptly arrested by police for pollution. In Sochi, political activists and NGOs were given an unmistakable message: protest at your own peril. 6 months before the Games, Vladimir Putin issued a decree saying there would be no protests during the Olympics. They eventually backpedaled a little bit, and they set up these special protest areas, including one in Costa, which was 7 miles to the nearest Olympic site, under a highway overpass, and guess what? Basically, nobody showed up to protest there. There were protests from Pussy Riot, the art collective, and look what happened. Actually, a Cossack showed up with a whip and literally whipped them. That was not part of the performance. Around the world, thanks to Russia's anti-LGBTQ law passed in advance of the Games, we saw protests. We also saw Circassian activists who wanted to raise the history of the fact that 150 years before the Sochi Olympics, there was a genocide of Circassian people on that very mountain. In Rio, we saw energetic activism spearheaded by the Comité Popular da Copa do Mundo e das Olimpíadas, the popular committee of the World Cup and the Olympics, which brought together political organizers with academics, neighborhood associations with NGOs. They highlighted the negative effects of the Olympics, writing research-driven dossiers, organizing public events, and fomenting street protests. There were numerous mobilizations ahead of the Olympics, including one in July that you can see some images from here. 2 big mobilizations on the day of the Games. This was at Copacabana. It actually diverted the route of the torch relay. Also, there was one that afternoon at a plaza close to the Maracanã, where you can see the police presence was incredibly intense. Protesters marched that day and were eventually tear-gassed for their efforts. There was also a lot of activism emerging from the favelas that were affected by the Olympics, one of them being Vila Autódromo, a favela that was steamrolled basically to make a large parking lot for the Olympic Games. Strong leadership, it must be said, came from women who are part of the community. You can see some of the images here from the spray painting around during the build-up to the Games. But the women like Maria de Peña were key leaders. Then there's Eloisa Helena Costa Berto, who is a candomblé practitioner and priestess, so her home doubled also as a temple, and it was steamrolled, as I say, for a parking lot. Vila Autódromo had a celebration toward the end of the Games of the resilience that they showed. 20 houses did end up being built in the spot, 500 families or so being displaced. There was actually an impromptu march over to the Olympic Stadium that was very well received by the people there. The police stayed away, and people were quite friendly, actually. So what are the lessons that we can draw from these activist campaigns? First of all, I suppose, protest early and often. It's most effective to stave off the Games before the IOC hands them to your city. Just ask Budapest, Hamburg, and Boston, where activists have recently torpedoed their cities' bids. Also, I would say that allies can come from unlikely sources. Think back to Denver, where there were fiscal conservatives that were concerned for the very reasons that the professors were delineating before. We saw that in Denver, where conservatives teamed up. Third, I would say that we do not yet see a fully formed international anti-Olympics movement. There's inklings of that, and some activists are traveling to different sites, but you can see that what we have is a moment of movements rather than a movement of movements. So I put the No Olympics Los Angeles slide up there because they're a good example. They've got a lot of coalition partners, groups that were already active that are feeling like they're affected by the potentiality of a 2028 Olympics. And finally, movements create political space for Olympic athletes to become athlete activists. A number of US athletes who have qualified for the Pyeongchang Games, for example, have taken direct inspiration from the Black Lives Movement, the WNBA here, or the NFL, and have talked about the possibility of seeing dissent. Here's just two of them, Alana Myers-Taylor and Carrie Jones, who have qualified for the next Olympics. So what's the road ahead? It's rocky, to be sure. In the short term, Pyeongchang, tension has spiked with Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un ratcheting up the global stress levels tweet by tweet, with Trump promising fire and fury like the world has never seen, Kim Jong-un threatening to annihilate Guam, all of this raising concerns about the possibility of nuclear war. Meanwhile, Gianfranco Casper of Olympic honcho said what you can see up there, almost goading the leaders, in my opinion, saying that there's no plan B. Now, having no plan B, in my opinion, is an irresponsible position. And as we move closer to the games in Pyeongchang, the IOC should not use athletes as political pawns. If Pyeongchang proves too dangerous, the games should just simply be canceled or at the very least postponed. We've seen this before in Berlin in the World War I period, as well as London and Helsinki in the World War II period. Longer term, as the race for the 2024 Summer Games unfolded, we saw bitter interest dwindling. The IOC came up with a creative approach, offering a double allocation to Paris and Los Angeles. Both cities have activist movements that are building steam as we go. Now, the Olympics are like a once reliable car that is breaking down. But instead of fixing it, the IOC has essentially affixed a piece of dark tape over the check engine light. The IOC has continued to act like a profit-gobbling cartel, and it is hurtling ahead at top speed, using the Olympics to service the interest of a privileged sliver of the global 1%. But as the great Stuart Hall has noted, hegemony is never forever. Anti-Olympics activists are fighting the games around the globe to make sure that's absolutely the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jules. I think that after my nice cameos, thanks for those inserting me in there, it's time for a coffee break. So we'll be back after this bell starts ringing in the hall. Please make your way back here for our final two presentations. Oh, sorry, and Jens has a couple. Sorry, forgot about that.
No coffee yet, please. I'd like to just to prepare you for the next logistical exercise, although it is this evening. You can all now start out by the registration to pick up your vouchers for the activities, because there are capacity limits, so you need to have a voucher for the activities tonight. The idea is that when the evening session or the late afternoon session is over, you go and pick a sandwich, something very light meal on your road to a very physically exhausting evening. Either you have different options to choose from. First of all, it will all take place in the park near to the hotel, and there is a map you can get out here in the reception where all the activities are plotted in. You will have, for those of you who feel that your physical efforts should be saved until a better day, there is the Kennis Cafe, a very lively debate cafe, over at the hockey club in front of the hotel. Now, am I pointing in the right direction? Yes. There is a hockey club, and then clubhouse of this hockey club, Kennis Centrum, the Knowledge Sports Center Netherlands, will have a cafe with a very lively debate, music, on new trends in sport. You will hear about the battle over the new trends, who wants to own new activities, and new ways of creating social inclusions. And you will have music and perhaps a beer and a snack, who knows. Then for the Puritans and those who feel that they have sitting too much on their chairs in the past 48 hours, I can really recommend that you go to Fontes Sport University, bring your sports shoes. There will be a variety of innovative activities there. I know they have a very big climbing wall. I don't know if it's open, and I don't know exactly what's going on, but I'm sure that they are really at the forefront of technology in sport. And you have a number of vouchers for ice skating, and you can rent skates. There are vouchers also for rent the skates. Those of you who survive can also you can also go swimming in the Peter Hogeband swimming center that we passed with the bus yesterday. And you can also go into the field lab, where we have also vouchers for seeing how they work with every little millimeter skin movement in the water to produce swimming champions using the most modern and nerdy technology you can think of. It all takes place here in the park in various locations. Go pick up your favorite activities and get a voucher, and we will have that open all day long. But the principle is first come, first served. And now. Here. And Dutch cheese. So you will not only have sandwich tonight, you can also, after all the activities at 10, from 9:30 and on, there will be soup and Dutch cheese here and one beer on the house.
Good morning, everyone. This is my first can join and know. Thank you for welcoming me. Today about could safely. Coast City was supposed to embrace the in the past discrimination against women and LGBT people. Journalists arrested and harassed, misery brought to local populations by environmental degradation, and workers cheated of wages and dying on stadium construction sites. Still, my essential message is one of hope, as there are solutions before us that could lead to durable change, so that these events may at last fulfill their potential for good. I first took an interest in mega sporting events in 1993 while I was living in Hong Kong, and China was bidding to host the 2000 Olympics. It was Beijing's promises to improve human rights in the country that gripped my attention. This is a slide, some of you may even remember this. To wash away the stain of the Tiananmen Square killings in 1989, Chinese leaders needed the Olympics. And they were prepared to release political prisoners and to make serious reforms to get the Olympics. But because the bloodshed in China was too recent, they lost out to Sydney. And when China did host in 2008, the IOC leaders did not hold them accountable to their promised reforms. Instead, China locked up critics like health advocate Hu Jia and shut down hopes for change. Beijing 2008 became a repressive template for how authoritarian countries would play the sports federations and undermine the values of sport and human rights. I revisit this because Beijing is hosting the Olympics again in 2022. In a much worse and more brittle political context than before, the worst human rights environment in the post-Tiananmen period. I would also add that they clearly have ambitions to host the World Cup, so watch this space. Because they got away with abuses in 2008, China's leaders surely expect to bend the Olympic system to their will again for the 2022 Winter Olympics. In 2008, it was said that there would never be a more expensive games than the Beijing Olympics. It was $40 billion. For Sochi in 2014, that cost skyrocketed to $53 billion. And for the Qatar World Cup, it is going to be an estimated $250 billion. So we've never seen costs like this, and the scale of the costs can also lead to a scale of abuse. At Human Rights Watch, we have documented abuses tied to the 2014 Sochi Olympics, the 2015 Baku Games, the 2016 Rio Olympics, the 2018 FIFA Russia World Cup, and the 2022 Qatar World Cup. Our research has proven that if you award a mega sporting event to a serious human rights abuser or a country that has no functioning rule of law and no press freedom, you will create misery for local residents, rights activists, and journalists. What abuses are we talking about? Property rights, when people are bulldozed from their homes to make way for infrastructure and stadiums without fair compensation. As Jules mentioned in his remarks, many Beijing citizens were evicted without compensation in the run-up to China's Olympics, including families who had lived in hutongs for centuries. Migrant workers' rights, as we see here, when workers have to pay fees that may put them in conditions of bondage, they have passports withheld, they're cheated of wages, and must work in dangerous, sometimes deadly conditions. 20 workers, that's up 3 from the number of 17 in June, are documented to have died building FIFA's World Cup in Russia. And at least one North Korean forced laborer died in the shipping container he lived in on the St. Petersburg Stadium site. Repression of civil society, including environmental and other rights monitors. Harassment and jailing of journalists. Blatant discrimination against women and LGBT people. We've documented, for example, the human rights catastrophe caused when 13 million women and girls were banned from playing sport or sport in state schools in Saudi Arabia, and also the attacks on LGBT citizens when Russia's anti-gay law was passed in advance of the Sochi Olympics. This is the Sochi Olympics Stadium. So these abuses are cascading down the Olympic food chain. Does anyone in the audience know what this picture is of? Can anyone identify this stadium? This is the Saparmurat Turkmenbashi Olympic Stadium in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. It was built from 2013 to 2017 to host the Olympic Council of Asia Indoor Martial Arts Games. Those games took place in September with enormous human rights abuses. And the fact that among this audience of experts, no one could identify this stadium is part of the problem. These abuses took place in Turkmenistan, a country that's comparable, close to the abuses that you see in North Korea. It's a complete police state. And yet, Turkmenistan has never hosted the Olympics. The stadium is called the Turkmenbashi Olympic Stadium, so they obviously have Olympic ambitions. So this is the trend that ought to keep sports officials up at night. The world's biggest human rights abusers increasingly want to host the biggest tournaments. Repressive leaders see hosting as a chance to sports wash their image, to build grand infrastructure, silence critics, and shore up legitimacy and nationalism. This slide is a list of upcoming mega sporting events. It's going to be familiar to most of you. These are the major ones. There are a lot of smaller ones, like the Asian Indoor Martial Arts Games in Turkmenistan. And this is what really should keep officials up at night. But this year, we've also got we have reasons for optimism. We have, you could say, moved the ball on human rights. As we heard in the session yesterday with Nikki Dryden and Brendan Schwab, both the IOC and FIFA have agreed that the UN guiding principles will apply across their operations. This is a very significant reform that Human Rights Watch and our colleague organizations have been pushing for since the UN guiding principles were passed in 2011. But 2018, next year, is going to be a year of reckoning. It's the moment when the IOC and FIFA can and must turn their paper reforms into meaningful action. When we first engaged with the International Olympic Committee before the Beijing Olympics, they claimed that sport has nothing to do with human rights. And it was only after we produced evidence of abuses that the IOC started to listen. FIFA was under enormous pressure to reform after its corruption and governance crises, and after choosing Russia and Qatar, two serious human rights abusers, to host the 2018 and 2022 World Cups. Sunday marked the 200-day countdown to the FIFA World Cup in 11 cities across Russia. In the last 2 years, especially since John Ruggie's report calling for human rights reforms, FIFA has put in place many policies and some systems with the Russian government to monitor labor rights abuses. However, these systems have not been transparent, as is required by the UN guiding principles, and have been unable to stop or remediate serious abuses such as arrests of journalists, North Korean forced labor building the St. Petersburg Stadium, or the threats and detention in Volgograd of Human Rights Watch's researcher who was investigating wage theft. How can we fix this broken system? There must be recognition that governments like Russia and Qatar choose to host these events to build political soft power. That means that the political leaders at the top of FIFA and the IOC have to enforce the rules they set without double standards. Not one standard for Russia and China and another standard for the rest of the world. If they don't do this, human rights will never be meaningfully protected. This is a copy of our 2012 report, Building a Better World Cup. We heard earlier at Play the Game from Supreme Committee leader Hassan Al-Thawadi. There is good news from Qatar. For many years, Qatar's kafala system of modern-day slavery has created abusive conditions. The exit visa requirement allows employers, or even former employers, to prevent a migrant worker from leaving the country. Other abuses Human Rights Watch has documented include late or unpaid wages, crowded and unsanitary conditions, and bad ventilation in a country where daytime temperatures can reach 46 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, some FIFA sponsors, including Coke and Adidas, who underwrite the 2022 World Cup, have correctly turned up the heat for reform. Brands can be tarnished by association not with the beautiful game, but with ugly abuses of workers' rights. In October, under investigation by the ILO for violating the Forced Labor Convention, Doha finally pledged to move on a series of reforms. These are migrant workers in Qatar. These include a minimum wage, allowing workers to leave jobs, tracking work contracts, and basic health and safety protections, including for the country's extreme heat. This was a topic of a report that we did in September of this year. The jobs created by World Cup construction have the potential to lift millions out of poverty. A livable wage for these workers would make the remittances sent home a more meaningful source of income. These reforms, if implemented, could be a game changer, not just in Qatar, but across the Gulf, where similar abusive migrant labor conditions exist, and we work at Human Rights Watch on all of the Gulf countries. So that's the heart of my message. Imagine if, instead of causing abuses, the World Cup could be a catalyst to transform the kafala labor system across the entire Gulf region. In organizing the first World Cup, FIFA's third president, Jules had a vision. He dreamt of achieving peace and thought that the same friendly competition between players in a soccer match could transfer to nations through international sports. For Rame, FIFA had an important role to play in promoting ethical values. In our modern era, Rame's grand vision of peace through sport and, frankly, ethical values is still an achievable goal. This is why we do the work at Human Rights Watch. So just as when Rame created the World Cup in the 1930s, the sports world is at a moment of change and transformation. With major events hosted by major human rights abusers over the next 4 years, that's between now and 2022, will the IOC and FIFA lead or retreat? Will we, in the global sporting community, use sport as a lever to improve human rights? Or will we look the other way as the trend of abusive governments manipulating sport, repressing their citizens, and hosting mega sporting events for their own ends continues? The solution is not just to set rules, but to play by them, and to make the system public and transparent. That is also what is required by the UN Guiding Principles. In advance of the June 2018 opening match in Russia, FIFA can and must rectify the abuses taking place and continue to press for implementation of the new labor standards in Qatar. Implementation will be critical. FIFA and the IOC need to institute a monitoring system that is transparent. That means that everyone in the room can see it and understand what is happening, and make such protocols preconditions for hosting. We all love to watch the Olympics and the World Cup, and we all want to enjoy elite competition at the highest level. We want to cheer for our teams and for our favorite athletes, but competing in and enjoying sports should never have a high cost in human rights and lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Minky, for this poignant reminder that our sporting activities are political choices as well, and that it's a very complicated and fraught situation of hosting mega events. And so with that, we'd like to invite Federico to the stage to talk about the FIFA perspectives of sustainability and the World Cup. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Christopher, and thanks as well, Minky, for the some of the words you said. I think it is part of the words that I will use to make my presentation will as well refer to what Minky just said and our commitment to protecting and promoting human rights in the world of sports and in connection with our activities. Thanks as well for the opportunity for me to be here today. I must confess that we were originally not invited to the conference, and it was us who actually contacted Jens to offer the possibility of being here, to which he, of course, immediately reciprocated with a nice invitation. Now you must think this guy must be a masochist, being here to representing FIFA and talking at the Play the Game conference, but that's not the reason why I'm here. The main reason is rather that of directly presenting the work that we do instead of having others outside, as it was used, the word as was used yesterday by Mr. Kirkeby, outsiders speaking about a work which is, of course, for obvious reasons, very difficult for outsiders to understand because of the lack of insight into our daily work. Therefore, I'm very thankful, Jens, for the invitation and the possibility of being here. As head of sustainability and diversity at FIFA, me and my team are responsible for the sustainability strategies of FIFA and the FIFA World Cup, as well as for topics such as human rights, labor rights, diversity and anti-discrimination, accessibility, football contributions to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, social development and environmental protection. But because of a lack of time today, I will be only focusing on human rights in connection with our activities. This is a topic which is very dear and very close to me also personally. Me and my family experienced human rights violations back in the 70s in Argentina when my father was for no reason incarcerated and probably also tortured, and we were forced to flee away from our home, and we had as well family members and friends being kidnapped and killed by the military regime. So I definitely cannot be myself indifferent to the suffering of others, and in particular not to the suffering of others that are related to my professional responsibility. Through the global activities of our organization and the FIFA World Cups, FIFA is touching the lives of billions of people, and this is through the work that is being done in connection with the game of football itself, but also through job creation, infrastructure development, capacity building, and the organization of the competitions. And with this global reach and this touching upon the lives of so many people, as discussed in almost all the sessions yesterday, it comes a heightened responsibility for organizations like FIFA, but also for other sport governing bodies, to preserve the inherent dignity of and equal rights of everyone touched upon or possibly touched upon by our own activities. And we need to make sure that the adverse effects to human rights are prevented and addressed adequately. That is why, as it was mentioned by Minky before, we have integrated a specific article on human rights protection and promotion in our statutes and our constitution. That is why we have developed, as the first international sports organization, a dedicated human rights policy. That is why we have a full-time specialist on human rights, a human rights manager in our team. That is why we have an independent human rights advisory board formed by independent experts from the UN system, from civil society organizations, from trade unions, and from the private sector, who continuously looks at our own activities and independently provide us with their input in order for us to be kept challenged in everything we do and become better. And that is why our due diligence processes have grown strong, faster than any other multinational organization in the last decade. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why, as acknowledged by other sports organizations themselves, we're ahead of the game in the world of sports and can stand as well in comparison with at least the top 11% of multinational enterprise based in Switzerland today when it comes to our human rights due diligence processes. While many challenges lie ahead of FIFA and its partners on this topic, it is important for us that we know and understand that tackling salient human rights risks following the guidance of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is a sincere commitment for our organization. Now, this all might sound good. These are words for you. These are documents, as Minky was mentioning, for her. And it actually is good news, because this is the pioneer work being done in the world of sport. No one else has done it before. But more important than that, it is the impact on those people who are affected or could be affected by our activities that it's important. It's what's happening on the ground and how our activities contribute to ensure the respect for the rights of people that are or may be affected by FIFA's activities. So let me first illustrate it with a couple of examples. Unfortunately, we don't have time for making many examples, but how we implement those human rights commitments when it comes to the relation of the FIFA World Cup stadiums. The World Cup stadiums are the most important part of hosting a FIFA World Cup. In preparing the tournament, construction, a major renovation is almost always necessary. And with that, in the construction sector, as you might understand, there comes considerable risks to workers involved in that construction work. In Russia, we have developed a tailor-made monitoring system together with a local organizing committee. The system has been successfully implemented for the past year and a half. And as part of that system, we are collaborating with an independent Russian expert institution on the monitoring of labor conditions. This is something that was never done before. Same as the IOC had said many years ago, human rights is not related to sports or to our activities. FIFA has always had as well in the past that position of human rights. We do not build stadiums, so why is that has anything to do with us? Well, that situation changed with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 2011, and with the acknowledgement by FIFA as part of its reforms that indeed these risks are associated with our activities, and we do have a responsibility towards protecting the human rights of those affected by our activities, and in particular those of the migrant workers and workers in the construction sector. So this institution we're working with permanently examines whether the working conditions on the construction sites complied with the applicable conventions of the ILO, with the laws of the Russian Federation, and with the best practice to ensure decent working conditions. The monitoring team visits each of the 10 stadiums under construction or renovation on a quarterly basis to review relevant documentation such as labor contracts, health and safety procedures, inspect the construction sites, interview construction workers, review whether previous recommendations have been implemented, and provide training on decent working conditions to construction supervisors. Since the launch of the system in June 2016, a total of 72 inspections were carried out. We're also working with the BWI, the Building and Woodworkers International Trade Union, and with the Russian Construction Workers Union, the RBWU, and their representatives participate as well in these monitoring inspections and are part of the results and recommendations that come out of them. Out of the 33 visits that were carried out in 2017, 23 were accompanied by representatives from trade unions. And in none of these inspections, the results that were identified by the local team and by the expert institution were not confirmed by the trade union, which means that the system is robust and has the scrutiny of those who are more interested in safeguarding the rights of the workers, namely the trade unions. Now, this is not to say that all is well. As you can imagine, issues are piling and there are problems coming up at every single inspection that we carry out. But we continue to find problems through our monitoring system, and this is the main purpose of it, finding issues, and in particular, these issues are coming from companies that are either newly employed or have not been monitored in the previous system. But the systems allows us to identify those issues, address them, and have a 72% of improvement from one inspection to the next one. So issues are being identified, every time come up again, but we're able through the system to improve the situation on a constant basis. Moving to Qatar, the second example. We have been working closely with the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy over the past 3 years. And as you know, they're responsible for building the infrastructure for the 2022 FIFA World Cup. Just last week, I was in Qatar. We were working on the development of an integrated sustainability strategy, both for for 3 parts, FIFA, the local organizing committee, and the national government. It's the first time that this is happening. And this sustainability strategy includes a systematic human rights risk assessment and the respective strategic measures. Neither the FIFA World Cups in the past nor any other sport event has ever had that before. Amongst others, the Supreme Committee created a new workers' welfare standard specifically for the tournament. An independent third-party external monitor further bolsters the auditing and inspections process of the standard and provides a transparent and public report which is available online. The Supreme Committee has also signed an agreement with trade unions, also the first of its kind in a country like Qatar without trade unions, with BWI to conduct joint inspections on construction sites, training and a review of existing grievance mechanisms. Several of the representatives from the European trade unions that have publicly stated and participated at those inspections publicly stated that they consider the health and safety standards on these sites, and here I'm talking about the FIFA World Cup sites. We're not talking about the entire construction sites in the country, but the FIFA World Cup construction sites for which FIFA and the Supreme Committee are directly responsible under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. They consider that these standards, and I quote, are excellent. In fact, we are told that many of them, the trade union representatives, when going back to their own countries, have used the experience of what they have seen in those construction sites as best practice in health and safety measures. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is only a snapshot of some of the activities that we're carrying out in the field of human rights in order to make livable all the commitments that we have as part of our statutes and our policies. 2017 was also a very successful year for our fight against discrimination. Through our monitoring system that we have applied in our 871 matches qualifiers for the 2018 World Cup, we deployed observers at 177 matches around the world. This has led, as many of you know, to many sanctions, in particular on topics like homophobia, for which FIFA had in the past never sanctioned a member association. But more importantly, it has helped us sensitize our member associations on the topic of discrimination and led to new projects and campaigns to prevent that from happening in the future. We also reviewed our bidding and hosting requirements for the 2026 FIFA World Cups and for all other FIFA tournaments with respect to human rights. Now, the bidders will have to meet additional criteria, make public commitments to human rights, submit detailed risk assessment, and propose strategies to address potential adverse human rights issues. This is all new, and it's coming as a result of the work that we've been conducting in Russia and in Qatar, which is becoming a bigger leverage for FIFA in connection with its event as of 2026. There is no doubt in my mind that there are still many issues and challenges ahead that we need to address. That there are many processes that we have to improve to have a robust system, but we, as well as the Independent Advisory Board on Human Rights, believe that we are on the right track. Irrespective of the in-house expertise that we now have available, we do believe in the power of stakeholder engagement and have, for the development of all the mentioned activities and policies and regulations and systems, always consulted the relevant stakeholders, including the most critical ones. Unfortunately, in some cases, we have met fierce resistance of collaboration, sometimes based on non-factual, biased analysis of the situation at hand, sometimes even worse, based on pure lies that have helped perpetrate the prejudices against our organization. While I can certainly understand that the crisis which FIFA went through does not help in restoring trust and promoting a constructive approach from one day to the other, some individuals and organizations continue to purposely abuse the FIFA and FIFA World Cup names to draw attention in a way that they could not do by telling the truth. I'm in no illusion that what you have just heard from me alleviates all concerns. And frankly, it shouldn't. It shouldn't alleviate any of your concerns. It is important that everyone continues to assess our work critically and hold us to account where we are failing to live up to our responsibilities. I do not work in communications, I work in sustainability. And those who know me know very well that I'm a stubborn fighter for a fairer, more diverse and more sustainable sport, and for a FIFA that takes its responsibilities seriously. And as an insider, which I am, I can tell you that despite the challenges inherent to the sustainability area at any organization, my commitment that of my team, and that of FIFA as a whole will not diminish, and will continue to contribute, as the slogan of this conference says, to riding waves of change, and hopefully always bigger waves of change. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite all of the speakers to come take your place at the table, please. Is that everyone? Hi. Okay. No, there's a spot for you. Oh, okay. Oh, that's right. Okay. Well, thank you all for the wonderful presentations, and I would like to take the chair's prerogative to provoke at the first opportunity. The title of this session is Sustainable Mega Events, and I wonder if that isn't a contradiction in terms. Can we have something that is sustainable and mega at the same time? And as we've heard from numerous speakers throughout this conference about the results of mega events, they're pretty dire. We have abandoned venues, we have human rights abuses, we have negligible positive legacies, and this story repeats itself across the globe. Yet the events are becoming ever bigger. This is the Citius Altius Fortius motto of the Olympics. And so not only do athletes have to become bigger, stronger, and faster, but the cities that host them have to produce ever bigger, stronger, faster venues and become ever grander Olympic sites. And now with the World Cup expanding to 40 teams, the 2026 World Cup will be ever bigger with ever more opportunities for corruption, for overspending, for human rights abuses across multiple international, local, and regional jurisdictions. So if this is indeed a contradiction in terms, to have a sustainable mega event, what are the possible solutions? We see this economically, it's unviable. Socially, it's also unviable. Why do we continue to do this? And what hope can we have that even incremental changes can keep up with the ever-increasing gigantism of these events? And how can our definitions of sustainability change to include political, social, environmental, and human and civil rights-based sustainable practices? So I open that to the table, and then we'll come to the crowd for more questions.
Hi. Thank you for the framing question. I would also like to respond to our friend from FIFA's presentation by saying it is, I titled my remarks, Moving the Ball on Human Rights, because I think it is important to say when there has been progress. As most of you all know in the room, the UN Guiding Principles have 4 pillars. Due diligence, know the situation that you're getting into, know the human rights risks. Because Human Rights Watch had reported extensively on stadium and worker and other abuses around the Sochi Olympics, it was a knowable thing what the conditions are in Russia. Second pillar is monitoring. That monitoring is not just any monitoring, it has to be independent. The monitoring that FIFA is doing is with the Klinsky Institute, which is a state-affiliated organization. Human Rights Watch is independent monitoring, and we have to be independent. It's why we didn't join the Human Rights Advisory Board, a very good body. Our reporting and our independent monitoring is essential. You cannot leave it to governments or to federations to monitor themselves. I shouldn't have to explain that further. Remediation, what has been done? The rule is know and show. Know what happened on your site and show what you've done to remediate it. Have workers been compensated for deaths? Transparency, accountability. We can't just take FIFA's word for it. We don't take the IOC's word for it, and we're not going to take FIFA's word for it. So I think those are the 4 pillars. That's the standard. I salute FIFA for the incredible changes that it has made since the John Ruggie report. FIFA 2.0 includes human rights. There's a Human Rights Advisory Board that is independent. It is important. There has been the FIFA Human Rights Policy in June and the Human Rights Advisory Board report in November. These are all essential steps, but Russia is coming. The draw is December 1. This is an urgent, current problem. FIFA's steps are important, but it's going to have to accelerate. Thank you.
Please, Professor.
Yeah, it works. Okay, I will give you first a very good idea to stop the Olympics, for instance. We have published in 2008 an econometric model which predicts in advance the medals distribution across the nations. So the medals predicted were correct for 88% of the medals distribution. So why still convening the games? So it's a first response. I'm kidding a little bit saying that, okay? Now, my second point is that it is impossible to stop the Olympics or the FIFA World Cup or other mega sporting events because they are now enshrined into the economic system. So if you want to change the games, the mega sporting events, you have to change the economic system itself. I mean, in a nutshell, I would say you have to change the so-called financial capitalism, which is ruling everything today. I'm not very optimistic about that. And my last point is that if you cannot change the whole system, then, and this is my way of thinking, you have to attempt alleviating the worst consequences, like cost overruns, white elephants, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Harry, then
Yeah,
Federico.
it's a very good, interesting question. There are some hurdles. I've discussed this with Wladimir, and yes, taking away the auction can do something, but the reason it doesn't take away everything, because we have to have in mind that during the first stage, the agents, which I call them, the local municipality, they try to convince the government that yes, this is a good idea, and they also try to convince the local taxpayers, because nowadays it's very controversial. So you don't take away that with getting rid of the auction. And in addition, it's not an English auction. I mean, English auction is an open auction where you go to different bidders and they create a bidding wars. It's a one-shot auction where you sort of bid secretly, and that's it. And another thing which makes it difficult is that if you talk, I mean, use my theoretical perspective with the principal agent theory. I mean, if you have one principle, it's one unit, one organization, one company, whatever actually, that's different from the case when you have all the taxpayers as the principle, because that is actually what it is about. The government is the agent operating on behalf of the taxpayers, actually, and the taxpayers haven't been unified, although there are some very encouraging, interesting exemption nowadays, actually. If that, I mean, the referendums, yeah, that might be a way to go, actually. Secondly, or maybe thirdly or fourthly, nevertheless, this idea will be contradicted by the International Sport Federation, because except from FIFA, the Olympics is the main revenue source, the International Sport Federation. Athletics is the #1 in the Summer Olympics. Skiing, ice hockey, for them, the Winter Olympics is a very, very important source of revenue, actually. So, yeah. In summarize, also this free-riding behavior is very difficult. If you have that, it's very difficult, actually, to get rid of these motives, because then all these agents that have the motive to, giving false information and so on, hoping that, because in the end they hope that they will be hired, not necessarily by the government, but by other involved in the event, entrepreneurs, tourism industry, and so on. And all these motives, difficult to get rid of them, actually.
Federico.
Yes, I think that there might be a little bit of a contradiction, as you say, with it, but this contradiction exists in every human activity. Even this conference is not necessarily sustainable. We've all flown in from different parts of the world. We have a very substantial impact on the environment. Still, this conference is necessary to have this debate. So what we can do is actually the same applies to the FIFA World Cup, the Olympics, and other sports events. I think what you can do is try to have initiatives and plans in place, strategies in place in order to make sure that you minimize the impact that you have, the negative impact, and you maximize the positive impact. What I heard yesterday for the first time actually from you saying that for the first time I've heard, let's stop the Olympic Games, let's stop the FIFA World Cups. It is an interesting position. I think that is not a pragmatic one, and this position does not take into consideration the values of a mega sporting event like the FIFA World Cup or another sports World Cup or the Olympic Games in the whole scheme of sports development. And this is something that we should also not forget. These are not just events that are taking place. This is the iconic element and the ultimate place where every single athlete in the world wants to be. I was myself a volleyball player. I was a professional volleyball player, and my whole career was developed towards the fact that I wanted to become better. I wanted to get to the next team. I wanted to get into the national team. I wanted to go to the World Cup. I wanted to go to the Olympics. And all these elements are taken completely away by the simple fact of making sure the World Cup and the Olympics do not exist anymore. This is a huge, fundamental element in the development of sports that would very much affect the situation in sports development by simply taking rid of it. Although I imagine your proposal is is a drastic one in order for us to reflect about it. And when it comes to the effect of not having these events happening, I definitely agree with you. It's not just the Olympics, also for the FIFA World Cup. This is the main source of income for FIFA, and definitely without that income, the whole of, or the majority of sports development, football development worldwide would suffer dramatically, because most of the member associations around the world depend on funding which is generated by FIFA through the FIFA World Cup in order to exist and develop. And therefore, there's not just a one dimension that we can use to make this analysis of let's stop the World Cup, let's stop the Olympics, and all the problems will go away, and we will have a more sustainable event by not having an event. I think that we need to be pragmatic, and this is my position in terms of we need the World Cups, we need the Olympics. They have a fantastic impact, both economically but also from a sports perspective. And at the same time, we need to make sure that the negative impact that this event has are understood and minimized as much as possible. And the positive impacts that these events have can be maximized through proper strategizing and planning.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That's a great set of questions Chris has thrown on the table, and I share your healthy skepticism about the sustainability of mega events, certainly in the environmental sense, as Federico is pointing out. People flew here. It's nearly impossible to pull off in an environmental kind of way. That said, I'll focus on the Olympics for a second, since that's what I was talking about mostly today, in terms of how we could actually reorient them in a pretty massive way, which is required, in my opinion. One way would be to perhaps take the Olympic villages that are built up for every Olympics and have them flipped into meaningful mixed housing that includes social housing. It seems like it's always promised that that's going to happen. This is a concrete thing that would not be difficult to do. Vancouver and London essentially had to nationalize the projects because the private entities filling them out failed, flopped on their bellies, and miserably failed. So hey, the public's paying for it with their taxpayer dollars. Why not actually make a serious public use of it? That'd be a small gesture in the right direction for sure. Second, I would say the International Olympic Committee has to step up and start paying more. I mean, Rio de Janeiro, after the Olympics, they had a deficit of $35 to $40 million, and they asked the International Olympic Committee to kick in and just help them cover that last set of bills. And the IOC said, no, we can't do that. Meanwhile, 2 days later, Thomas Bach, the president of the International Olympic Committee, was talking publicly, bragging openly at a press conference about how they had $3.2 billion in assets in the IOC, making no connection whatsoever from the ask from Rio and the answer 2 days later from a high up in the IOC. So I want to say, though, before I pass the mic, is that I tried to highlight today that what we saw in Rio de Janeiro was egregious mismanagement, and we saw a lot of problems there. There's no question about it. But I want to highlight that I wouldn't necessarily categorize them as real problems. Don't get me wrong. There was serious problems in the organization of the games with Carlos Nuzman and everything we've seen afterwards. But I don't see them so much as real problems as Olympic problems. And if they're Olympic problems, then they need Olympic solutions from the people in the International Olympic Committee.
Hi. Okay, I'd like to open the floor to questions. Roving mic, please. Here, 1, 2, 3.
Nikki Dryden. My questions are for Federico. As an Olympian, I do applaud and I second Minky's that your work with the External Human Rights Advisory Board is so critical. And as an Olympian, I wish and hope that the Olympic movement hears that and sees what you're doing and takes the cue from you. But as a human rights lawyer, I still have questions and concerns, and I'm glad that you've asked for that feedback. Your colleague Fatma Samora has called the Russia 2018 World Cup that it will be a great World Cup, okay? But 20 workers have already died, 3 in the last 5 months. So my first question is, how can it be a great World Cup when 20 human beings are already dead to bring it to light? The second question is related to the Human Rights Advisory Board report from November. They had real concerns about the shortcomings in the evaluation process in Russia. So my question to you, second question is, how come FIFA is not pushing Russia the same way it's been pushing Qatar, where some better reforms are happening?
Thank you.
Thanks for your questions. Indeed, every event for which it's the construction of its infrastructure takes the life of a person, no matter how many they are. One person is one too many. It's something very regrettable and something that casts a shadow over the joy that an event like the FIFA World Cup or any other sport event can generate. We definitely regret that. The question that we need to ask ourselves is what are the mechanisms in place that enable us for those numbers not to be bigger? What are we doing in order to minimize the number of incidents and accidents happening in those construction sites, which we know are things that happen at every single construction site. The working conditions at construction sites pose very serious risks to the integrity of human beings, and therefore we need to ask ourselves, what can we do in order to minimize those risks? And what we try to do, again, in a pragmatic way, is putting up those monitoring systems and sending the experts, including those of the trade unions, in order to make sure that whatever issues are identified, and believe me, there are many issues identified, there have been probably many other big incidents that have been avoided because of the system being in place, that exists. And in the end, the World Cup will take place like previous World Cups, and we will always have to regret, unfortunately it's been the case for all the major events, big accidents and even fatalities. What we can do again is take our responsibility seriously according to the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, set up the mechanisms that we consider are the most appropriate with the right partners on board in order to minimize those risks to a minimum. The first question relates to the second one as well, because you make a difference between Qatar and Russia. I don't think that the analysis of the recommendations by the advisory board on the systems in Russia are correct, the ones you mentioned. There is in first place a recognition from the independent advisory board on the world and the systems that are in place. What we see is that there are, as part of that mechanism, we identify issues that are recurrent, we identify issues that perhaps are solved in one stadium but are recurrent and happening in another one at the next set of inspections. And therefore the recommendation is for us to continue putting an eye on those issues and putting additional pressure on the local authorities. The difference, however, and this is the difference of the contractual relationships that we have in both countries, in Qatar and in Russia, is there where the problem lies. In Qatar, we have a very strong and solid collaboration with the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy. They are directly responsible for the infrastructure. So they have a leverage that that we have in Qatar that we do not have in Russia, and that's the difference in the possibility for the system in Qatar to put pressure from the onset. So in Qatar, if you want to be part of any of the construction work happening at the FIFA World Cup stadiums, then you have to have a series of conditions that you have to abide to before you enter the procurement process. In Russia, the situation is different. And therefore, we have a different type of leverage because of the contractual relationship that we have in the two countries. That's mainly the explanation to that difference between the two.
Minky, go ahead.
Just a quick correction. It is not the case that workers have to die to build stadiums. The London Olympics, which were by any standard a mega event, there was not a single fatality on any of the construction sites. So I think it's not accurate that you have to have extremely high death tolls. But I wanted to return to one point, and that is, I think, the transparency point. And that is, it's hard for companies, it's hard for any organization, but I think also, making not only putting the policies on paper, but also bringing them to life. And I'd like to give the example of Human Rights Watch's researcher who was arrested. We have been seeking an answer from FIFA since May about what they were going to do to defend him. This is a researcher who was known to the IOC. He documented 500 violations on the Sochi Olympics. The IOC came and met with the workers, with him. And after that, he had no more harassment and intimidation. It is possible. This is why I say it requires political leadership from the top of FIFA. I think your team is doing a terrific job, but the answers to Nikki Dryden's question are that it also has to come from the top. It can't come just from within the organization. So is there that commitment on the top?
I feel compelled to answer to that. If I'm here today and if I'm doing my job, it's not because I am passionate about human rights. I'm being paid by FIFA to do this job. If there is an integration of an Article 3 of the statutes to protect and promote human rights, it is because the leadership of FIFA, and that is the FIFA Council, approved the integration of that in the statutes. If there is a human rights policy at FIFA, it's because the FIFA Council approved the existence of a policy. Our work, and this is always something that every time we do a step into the right direction, there's something new which comes up to still criticize what's being done. And before it was you do nothing. Now you start doing something, and then it says, okay, yeah, but we don't believe that you are doing it. You, Federico, you're doing it. It's not FIFA. It says, well, I am FIFA. I'm representing this organization. I'm doing it on behalf of this organization because I'm being put in the condition to do that, because there is a commitment at the top level to make sure that this integration happens. And when it comes to always criticizing, okay, this is on paper, but this is not happening. This is a policy, but there's no implementation. I gave a few examples, very clear examples, and the report from the advisory board reflects that very clearly. They have an insight which unfortunately other organizations don't have, for obvious reasons, and you mentioned, Minky, one of them. You don't want to be part of the advisory board, you want to be on the other side to be able to, as well, held us to scrutiny, and this is good, it's an accepted position. But because of that, you don't have insight in a lot of things that are going on, for which the advisory board and the members of the board do have, and have reported extensively about that work. So there are policies in place, there are mechanisms in place, and there are also measures taking place, both in Russia and in Qatar, but also at other levels of our work, in the procurement, in the supply chains, in the work with our member associations, in our work to fight discrimination in football, and in the work that we're doing on the accessibility field, both in the infrastructure side, but also in the requirements for services in connection with our events. There's a lot of work which is going on. You have access, and everyone has access to this information. We're always open to share this information with everyone. The advisory board has extensively reported about it. Whether you want to see that as facts and information which is talking about exactly what's going on the ground, or want to simply ignore it, that I cannot influence, but the information is available, and we're making, as I said, strong putting not just words to a policy, but also doing walking the talk through concrete measures.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 questions here, and then we have 3 questions there, and then we go to the back. So if we could take these 2 questions together, here in the center, please.
Okay. Matthias Fett from Hamburg. 2 quick questions. First, to the principal-agent theory, when it is in economics, I'm the agent as the applier for a job, and then I bring like certificates and stuff like that that prove my ability to work at this job with me. Are there possible solutions and to have similar things in sports when I want to host the Olympics or the FIFA World Cup? And is there a believable threat by the principal, like IOC and FIFA, to monitor me as a host city and then take away the rights when I violate these principles that are set? That would be a sign to take that away. And the second question is to Mr. Andreff. You said that there's the winner curse when you have 3 applying cities for 3 consecutive Olympic Games, and that there's only the winner curse on the first one. Why isn't that on the third one? Because giving also the information that Jules gave, when you host the latest Olympic Games, then you have more time to plan, more time to construct the infrastructure, and that is more valuable for you to get the latest instead of the earliest Olympic Games.
Okay, second question, and then we'll get...
Yeah, hi, Dennis from the University of Neuchâtel. I have a question about Olympic or sport migrant activism. Actually, on the night that Hamburg citizens rejected the bid in Hamburg for the 2024 Olympics, that I was a little bit part of in that activism. I felt very empowered and thought it would be a moment that maybe more cities would hold referendums for Olympic Summer Games, and then suddenly the IOC gives the games to Paris in 2024 and LA in 2028. What does that mean actually for the Olympic movement, the activism movement? And at the same time, we've seen in Brazil how before the World Cup in 2013 and during the World Cup, the police has heavily and massively repressed protesters and Olympic anti-activists. And I would like to know, and Russia is known for this kind of political repression in the streets as well. What is FIFA exactly doing and concretely doing to prevent that happening next year? Thank you.
Okay, I'm just getting a sign that we have about 5 minutes, which I don't quite believe, but please try to keep your answers short.
Should I answer?
Yes, go please.
Okay, yeah. Regarding principal agent, I forgot something minutes ago, a comment to Andreff's presentation. Namely, there are 2 reasons why Los Angeles Olympics in 1994 are the exception. One is that they were the only bidder. Secondly is that US government does not fund neither the World Cup nor the Olympics. The only responsibility they take are the security costs. Therefore, they had a shock in 2002 after the September 11, though. And a colleague of me, Victor Matteson, has proven that the 1994 World Cup in the US is the World Cup so far that comes best out without avoiding the white elephants. They used existing stadiums. You can say that, okay, US is a big nation, a lot of stadiums, but so is Germany, so is England, so are the others. But as long as there is expectations that the principal, in this case the government, will fund totally or partly, okay, then you all of a sudden have this free riding problem. And that is, in my opinion, a very important factor actually. The more responsible the agents are in terms of what they have to pay, well, the less likely they have to overspend actually.
Thank you. Professor?
Yeah, to make short a long story, if you want not to have a cost overrun and winner's curse with 3 candidate cities, you have to announce, I mean the ROC has to announce in advance that the 3 events will be allocated together on the same date. Then you will cut a part of the overbidding process or all the overbidding process. But I must say that even though I believe very much in my theory, you have other factors of cost overruns. Mismanagement can be one of them. The principal agent behavior described by Harry as well, or also the share of public funding into the overall funding. The less you have public funding, the less you have a chance to get cost overruns. And maybe a last point, one advantage of not having the winner's curse and no overbidding is that you would avoid a big part of corruption. Because why do you have corruption? Because the cities are competing together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Like someone likes to take, go ahead, Federico, if you choose.
Yeah, I think we need to answer his last question. There's a difference between Brazil and Russia that I would like to make. The problem you mentioned was mainly, or the demonstrations and the activism was very visible in 2013 in Brazil during the FIFA Confederations Cup. The request there was for health and education standards which were linked to FIFA standards. So that was the request from the people on the streets was padrão FIFA. That's what the Brazilians wanted to see, the high level of standards that were required for the organization of the World Cup set up as well for the health and education systems in the country. This was probably the first time that the Brazilians went on the streets in such a massive manner in many years. That type of protest is something we've seen, and me as an Argentinian, I know that protesting happening in our country much more than what was the case in Brazil. So the World Cup offer, or the Confederations Cup in that moment, offered that opportunity for people to go on the streets and protest about it. It was an unexpected, I believe, an unexpected situation both for FIFA and as well the Brazilian authorities. We condemned, and I was personally doing that at a press conference during the FIFA Confederations Cup, condemned the violence of the security forces in the country, the police forces and the military. And I was the first one as well at FIFA at an official press conference to congratulate the activism, the civil activism of Brazilians going out on the streets fighting for their own rights. And FIFA was very clearly, although not from the very beginning, but immediately after, it took a position which was that of supporting and applauding those initiatives and that activism on the streets. We've learned definitely from that experience, and what you will see, and that's why the difference with Russia, what you will see in Russia is we have established as part of our commitments through the human rights policy a collaboration with the security authorities. We are working with them in order to make sure that international standards are applied in the way that security forces work in the country for the FIFA World Cup. So this is our expectations, this is what we have communicated to them. We're training as well the private security forces according to international standards to protect human rights in their in the use of their or the application of their duties. It is important, however, to mention what are the responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principle. So it is not about any possible activity of activism human rights defenders or journalists working in the country, but those that are directly related to the FIFA World Cup or they're indirectly related to the FIFA World Cup. And to that, we will have as well for the FIFA World Cup in Russia human rights defenders policy and mechanisms in order to make sure that the rights of those fighting for human rights and protecting human rights as well as for journalists are being respected during that event.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll pass on your first question, Dennis. To
Just thinking
about
the protest in Brazil.
Yep.
It is true that we protest against the better conditions for education and health care, but we protest already also because the FIFA had many tax privileges, and then they exige the privilege to host for the country host the World Cup. Then the public was protest for them that as well.
Okay, I think we only have time for the last battery of questions, so we'll take the 3 questions on that side, and then after the questions, we'll fold them into the response to those questions into your final remarks, if that's okay. Jens.
I've got a very simple questions to Federico. You were talking about lies. Your words were pure lies about FIFA. So I'm not talking about lies, criminal lies conducted by FIFA officials and criminal behavior. I just simply ask you, can you give 2 or 3 examples of pure lies? I don't mean wrong, stupid headlines in tabloids or some minor facts. Pure lies, I would say relevant lies, for example, delivered at Play the Game or other relevant conferences and media. 2 or 3 examples, pure lies.
Okay, thank you. And then the 2 questions are right there. Yep.
Yes, Laura Robinson from Canada. It's not a FIFA question, but it is a comment I need from people concerning the IOC, in that Van Auken, concerning the Vancouver 2010 Olympics, successfully argued in our courts that they were a franchise of the IOC, and they successfully argued then that Canadian human rights laws did not apply to them. So our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, when the women ski jumpers came forward, even though the judge said, yes, these women have been discriminated against, yes, it's contravening the Canadian Charter, it does not fall underneath our charter, because basically the head office is there in Lausanne, not in Canada, which would be for every, if that decision applied to every Olympics, then it's sort of like a little island when the Olympics move in which the laws of the country, the human rights laws, do not exist. So I'd like you to comment on that.
Thank you.
In terms of the IOC.
Hello, Ian Mengel from Playa, small NGO. I want to ask everyone basically, but I want to take FIFA as an example. I remember when you started in 2005, Federico, as a single person. Now, I don't know, maybe you are 10 or so in your department, but I guess other departments in FIFA are much bigger. So it's about structural, perspective. And then, for example, you commit 0.7 of your budget for social initiatives. But the more important question is what happens to the 99.3%. So maybe we can think about that.
Okay, great. Thank you for your questions. And I think we'll start with Jules, and we'll just move down the line for answering these questions and final comments.
Okay. To your question about referenda, I think that referenda should be a mandatory aspect of applying for the Olympics. Just build it into the budget, and if the Olympics are so great for everybody, there should be no problem, right? They'll get voted through by this potential host city. Second, to your point about the movements that are happening around the globe, in Los Angeles and Paris, there are incipient movements. It's something to keep an eye on moving forward. Los Angeles Olympics are in 11 years, okay? 11 years. Now, on one hand, that can mean that you can corral the costs and get things done on time, all that. But it also creates a lot of possibilities for more activism. A lot can go wrong in 11 years. If you just let your mind's eye flip back 11 years, Saddam Hussein was just being captured. That feels like an eternity ago. Then you move that forward, that's when the LA Olympics are going to happen. So I guess the final thing I would say before I pass the mic to Hai here is that what would be the point at which FIFA or the IOC would say, you know what, yeah, we should cancel the Olympics? Like, what bright line has to be crossed? When I suggested before that the South Korean Olympics could potentially be canceled if the political heat gets too high, that's for the safety of the athletes, that's for the safety of the people, for the people who go to the Olympics. That to me seems non-controversial and obvious. So for those who are saying that the Olympics and FIFA must press ahead with their World Cup no matter what, because that's the pragmatic cost, what bright line would have to be crossed, not to get too apocalyptic? Thank you.
I would like to, Luis, as Executive Director of Atletas for Brazil, to some words.
Thank you, Ray. Speaking in the name of Atletas pelo Brasil, we just like to add that we really think that it's very important to involve the athletes in these discussions. I understand that there's a very high qualified people here, and that you are very good in researching and really following through all these scandals and all these issues. But the athletes, they are a massive power, and they really can make a very big difference. We are really breaking the silence in Brazil right now, and I believe if we can include them in a coordinate movement worldwide, we may have this that you're talking about. We may have breached this and say, no, we're not going to play. We are going to stop now and look and see how can we do this better.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, some comments about where to go and so on.
Just briefly.
The Olympics, for example, in my opinion, is ridiculous that the applicant should be a city. At least it should be whole nation, or best of all, several nations. Then you can host the skiing in where they have facilities, ice hockey where they have facilities, and so on and so on and so on. The UEFA 2020 is an interesting model, which, because of the Jubilee now, is hosted in 11 or 13 countries, actually. Secondly, the owner, which in this case is the IOC or the international sport federations, should take some responsibility, financial responsibility. It's ridiculous that the national government has to guarantee it financially, but they can do so because it has to do with competition. I mean, as long as cities are competing desperately to be the host, okay, then the owners set the premises, actually. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to respond to Jules' proposal that there are referenda for all mega sporting events, and I think that's a brilliant idea in principle. The problem is if these events continue to be awarded to very serious human rights abusers. I did see a survey from Beijing where the government touted that 99.9% of the population favored the Beijing Olympics for winter. Now, I'm sure they're tracking down the 0.001% of the population that said they didn't support it. That's the fundamental problem, and it goes to the heart of my argument. Human Rights Watch does not do reports on mega sporting events because we want to kick the IOC or kick FIFA. We do it because those are often pre-existing conditions that are significantly worsened, whatever it is, crackdown on civil society, journalists, workers' rights, whatever it is. If you give a mega sporting event to a serious human rights abuser, you will make it worse. We have proven that. So what do? It's a big problem. I don't think it's realistic to say that these events will be taken away. That is the thermonuclear option, really. But I think realistically, it's probably not going to happen. So we have to work with what we have. And the model that we've discussed here, the UN Guiding Principles, are the best model. It has the support of governments, it has the support of the UN, it has the support of Human Rights Watch, it has the support of sponsors. So we have a way forward, but we also have a crisis between now and 2022. I want to end on a more positive note and say that the human rights assessment requirements and hosting requirements that FIFA has put forward for 2026 are very important. They could be a game changer, at least for Morocco and the U.S., or Morocco and the United bid. The two bids, they're on the table now. In the case of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, that's 32 candidate cities. They're going to have to do a beauty contest using human rights to see who wins. That could roll back anti-gay laws in Charlotte. That could change bad immigration law and policy in Houston. It could deal with police brutality in Los Angeles. Every country in the world commits human rights abuses. But mega sporting events, FIFA, the IOC, and every single sports federation have an obligation that their event not worsen human rights conditions for the local populations. Thank you.
Thanks, Minky, as well, for those words. To answer to a couple of questions, first, the one on the lies, I never refer to anyone in the room or at Play the Game telling lies about FIFA. But two concrete examples you asked from me. One is the information that was disseminated by ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederations, that in first place were 1,400, and in the second information that was distributed or message that was sent, 4,000 workers have died or will die in connection with the construction of the FIFA World Cup infrastructure. That's not just inaccurate, that's a blatant lie. And therefore, here you have the first one. Now, that's nothing if it's only one organization making a statement for the sake of raising awareness about a topic. The problem starts when media, without asking any questions, without doing any sort of research, just pick up that number and include it in every single article that is written about the FIFA World Cup in Qatar since the day this statement was made. And it's there where the dissemination of a blatant lie becomes the norm for everyone. So all of a sudden, the FIFA World Cup is responsible for the death of 4,000 workers in connection with the construction sites. So this is not just a lie in first place, but it's irresponsible journalism for those who do not check the sources and do not know what the reality is, or if they know, even worse, use it for whatever purposes they have. That's the first one. The second lie that was disseminated around the world was the issue of the North Korean workers, and not the fact that there were North Korean workers working in the construction site in St. Petersburg, but who was the entity that was responsible for identifying and making sure, identifying the existence of those workers and making sure that the workers no longer work at a FIFA World Cup construction site. And that entity was FIFA and the local organizing committee. It was our monitoring system which identified those North Korean workers in the construction site. It was our monitoring system that enabled us to get into a discussion with the local authorities, the stadium authorities, and it was our statement that we do not tolerate the use of North Korean workers at any World Cup construction site that made possible for those workers not to be there anymore. So when it comes to the information being released to the news a few months later about that case, then and everyone takes it that, okay, FIFA is using North Korean workers. No, we were not using North Korean workers. We identified the existence of a legal system because Russia has an agreement with North Korea for the use of North Korean workers, but because we know what the dire conditions usually the North Korean workers are exposed to, we exposed the system, we mentioned it, and we removed them from the working site, making a very clear statement to the Russian authorities. So that's the second one. You asked me for two examples. I gave you two examples. There are many others, but in the interest of time, I will stop here. Now, answering the second question coming from there, unfortunately, because of the light, I cannot see who you are, but you know a lot about the history of the sustainability department at FIFA. Indeed, it was 2003 when I started I was the only one in that department. Now, is it enough, the number of people we have now in the team? if you ask me, I will always say, no, it's never enough. We will not need to have more resources and more people. But what you need to understand is that we have a team which is formed of 7 people dedicated to the sustainability work of FIFA based in Zurich. We have 8 people based in Moscow working on the sustainability strategy for the World Cup in Russia. We have the first sustainability manager working in Qatar and a team of 30 people related to that. So it is a quite impressive number of people and a quite impressive number of resources put at the disposal of an area which is struggling in any organization. Any person working in the sustainability field at any company in the private sector knows that it's not the first priority. And indeed, that fight that we started 2003 when we started with this work has led to very positive results in that field. The 0.7% of our GDP, that was an initial or an initiative that I launched in 2003 when we discussed what should be the resources available for this field. And it was to align with the commitments made by the industrialized countries about the consensus of Monterrey in 2002 about investing 0.7% of GDP for development cooperation. Unfortunately, this is a percentage that only 5 or 6 countries in the world have achieved so far. Well, we have achieved that long ago. Unfortunately, you will always ask, oh, is that enough? What about the 99.3%? I try to see the glass half full instead of half empty. And of course, I will push for having more resources and more people. But in the meantime, there's a lot that has been achieved thanks to that 0.7%. And unfortunately, not many, even in the rooms, even the organizations and the media that are being represented here, have not achieved in their own fields. And the last element, and this is a little bit to respond to Minky with one example where I believe she's wrong with the fact that a World Cup can exacerbate or must exacerbate the negative conditions in a country. I believe that irrespective of the decision of going to Qatar, having that in mind, the World Cup taking place in Qatar today has had a tremendous impact on improving working conditions in the country and will have a tremendous impact in improving the working conditions and the labor rights for millions of workers, not just in Qatar, but in the region. The ILO cooperation with the state of Qatar is a proof of that. And therefore, let's think as well, not just of what the exacerbation of possible human rights violations could be, but what can an event like the FIFA World Cup, the Olympics, or any other sport event have as an impact in order to improve the conditions for workers and human rights in a given country.
Thank you.
A brief comment. As a citizen, I am in favor of a referendum before hosting mega sporting events. But as an economist, I would say that this referendum should be completed with a willingness to pay study. Just to give you an example, one of my students at the Russian International Olympic University in Sochi has done an interview with Sochi residents in 2013, and she has found that 93% of Sochi residents were willing to pay not to host the games.
Well, a big round of applause for our speakers, our panelists. And I have a very anxious international director here with some comments for you before the break.
Yeah. I take so much, talking about masochism and sadism, I take so much pleasure in extinguishing fiery debate and deprive you of the enlightening words of our panel. No, I'm sorry I have to stop the debate here as it's going very well, but we have other sessions that we now have to proceed to. But first I would like to thank the panel again. I think it was a really another panel living up to our expectations, which were already great. And I would like to acknowledge especially 2 persons without saying anything about the others. And one is Wladimir Andreff, who was taking part in the very first Play the Game conference in 1997. And I have a supporter that has been very important for us because of the quality and attitude he has brought to several of our conferences. And I have a picture of him playing, now we are talking about football, I have a picture of him playing football. And I think that picture, at the age of 50, yes. And I think that picture testifies to his abilities as an economist. It is Also, I would like to acknowledge Federico for having taken the initiative to ask for an invitation. This is quite new in Play the Game's history, that FIFA has asked for an invitation. For many years, FIFA did decline politely to our invitations, and then some people would come representing FIFA, but without a FIFA name tag. It was always very interesting to try to find out who these people were. This has fortunately changed since 2011, 2013, and last time we even had FIFA presidential candidates arguing their case. But it's very important that we have the international federations, and in this case FIFA, and if I, by mistake, I must say, or by delay, had not thought of FIFA, it was really, I would like to thank you for reminding us. And therefore, I would like to just say a few words about our invitation policy, because with regard to the IOC, we have asked them to be represented at the highest level for all our debates. And we have had IOC members here. We have had Dick Pound and Craig Reedy in various functions, but we have not had, you could say, representatives of the IOC leadership as of today. But that is the IOC's choice. Unfortunately, the director of the ethics commission, of the ethics work of the IOC, Margaret Girard-Sabely, had confirmed, but she simply had to withdraw due to an overload of work with the individual cases she's currently handling, which tells you something about the situation. This should not prevent the IOC from sending political leaders to the debates. With regard to the international federations in general, I must say, because our focus was not so much on FIFA and on other international federations, I think we should have been more energetic than we were in assuring their participation, because as the program has come out, I see that we made a mistake in not inviting them more directly and timely. But we will compensate for that, as we have done on other occasions, and let's hope that they will then actually accept the invitations. That was just a few words on the setup. Thanks again to all of you. And now, again, find yourself a map, find yourself a voucher for tonight's activities. And now we have 5 sessions spread over the Eindhoven rooms, and here we will have a very, very interesting session on transforming the business of pro cycling, including the former UCI president Brian Cookson. And those of you who do not attend that session, I ask you kindly to leave the room to go to the other interesting sessions on big data, on EU sports policies, on Kristen Worley's fight for her human rights as a transgender athlete, and on sports, I'm probably using the wrong term here, I apologize, and about sports observatories, how to build a national analyst institute in your country. Thank you. And you are welcome also to delay the end of these